It was a brisk Tuesday morning in Philadelphia, the kind of day where the air had just enough bite to remind you that fall had arrived. The leaves, tinged with orange and gold, scattered across the sidewalks as people hurried to their daily routines. In a modest apartment on the west side of the city, Daniel Morrison stood at the kitchen counter, a stack of neatly signed papers in front of him. He wasn't looking at the papers, though. His eyes were locked on his reflection in the microwave, adjusting his tie with precise care, every movement calculated, as if the world was watching. The kitchen smelled of burnt toast, the remnants of an overcooked breakfast that had once been a simple ritual in their marriage, a ritual he no longer cared about. As he smoothed down the burgundy silk of his tie, a tie that cost more than the rest of his wife's wardrobe combined, his thoughts drifted to the future he was about to carve for himself. The future without Elena. Elena, he muttered to himself, a hint of frustration in his voice. It's over. In the next room, Elena Carter, his wife of 5 years, stood by the stove, her hands moving mechanically as she flipped the pancakes. She wore an old cardigan, faded blue, with a modest white shirt underneath. Her jeans were patched at the knees, not out of style, but out of necessity. She hadn't noticed that Daniel was already checked out of their marriage, not yet aware that the silent tension between them had been festering for months. Daniel could feel his anger bubbling up again as he watched her. He hadn't even made it a full year without growing tired of her quiet, unassuming nature. He had worked hard to climb the corporate ladder at Hartford and Associates, sacrificing his time, his values, even his relationships. But Elena, with her meek smile and unpretentious demeanor, had always seemed more of a hindrance than a partner. He had everything now, a burgeoning career, a fancy apartment in the city, and the respect of his colleagues. What did Elena have? A small job at a law firm, no family, no connections. She had nothing but her silence, which had become suffocating. Sign the papers, Elena, he said, his voice cold, devoid of the warmth it once had. Her hands paused mid-flip. She didn't turn around, just stood there, shoulders slumped, as if resigned to what was about to happen. The pancakes, now charred around the edges, filled the air with the bitter scent of failure. Sign the papers and let's both move on, Daniel repeated, his voice edging toward impatience. Elena's hand trembled slightly, the spatula hovering above the pan as she forced herself to breathe. She could feel the weight of the moment, but she didn't turn to face him. She couldn't, not yet. The hurt was too raw, too fresh. The last 6 months of their marriage had been spent watching Daniel slip further away, becoming someone she hardly recognized. "You've already checked out, haven't you?" She finally spoke, her voice a mere whisper, but it cut through the silence in the room. Daniel turned, his face flushed with frustration. "There's nothing to discuss. Elena, I'm done." He grabbed his briefcase, throwing one last glance at the woman he'd once promised to love. You knew this marriage was a mistake from the start. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena didn't respond. She simply set the spatula down, her gaze fixed on the pancakes that were now ruined. "I'm done," Daniel repeated, as if the words would somehow make him believe them. He turned on his heel and walked out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. Elena, her heart heavy with sorrow, didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just stood there, staring at the empty space where her husband had been moments before. Flashback. The beginning. 3 years ago, Elena had met Daniel Morrison at a company event, a quiet gathering with the partners and associates at Hartford and Associates. At the time, she had been working as a secretary, just another unremarkable face in the office. Daniel had been a junior associate, still struggling to prove himself in a competitive environment. His ambition had been palpable, a hunger that Elena found both admirable and, at times, overwhelming. In the early days of their courtship, Daniel had seemed different, vulnerable, kind, and full of dreams. He confided in her about his struggles, his debt, his worries about the future, and Elena had listened, offering him support without hesitation. But somewhere along the way, the man she had married had disappeared. In his place was a man consumed by ego, status, and power. His insecurities had grown, and so had his arrogance. He no longer needed her support. He wanted her admiration. The man she had once loved had become a stranger, someone who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. Present day, the final decision. Back in the apartment, Elena remained frozen in place for a long time after Daniel's departure. She had expected this, knew it was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. As she gazed out a window, her eyes caught a glimpse of the city below, a city that had once felt full of possibilities. Now it felt empty. She had given everything to this marriage, her heart, her trust, and her loyalty, but it had never been enough. Her thoughts drifted to the past, to her father's teachings. He had warned her that people reveal their true nature when they think there are no consequences. Her father had raised her to understand the value of human dignity, to see people for who they truly were, not just the masks they wore. And Daniel had shown her exactly who he was when he thought she had nothing to offer. Now, it was her turn to reveal the truth. Flashback, Elena's secret. Elena's father, Thomas Carter, had been a quiet man, an enigma to those who knew him, a man who controlled vast fortunes in silence, acquiring mineral rights and rare earth deposits across the world. His wealth was so hidden that even the most elite financial analysts couldn't calculate his net worth. To most people, he was just another billionaire, an anonymous name in the business world. But to Elena, he had been everything. She had grown up in a sprawling estate in Montana, a place far removed from the noise of the world. Her father had taught her to see beyond appearances, to understand the value of people based on their actions, not their status or wealth. She had left Montana for Philadelphia with a new identity, determined to live a life of simplicity and humility. She worked as a secretary, pretending to be just another face in the crowd. And when she met Daniel, she thought she had found someone who could see her for who she truly was. But instead, Daniel had only seen her as someone he could manipulate. For 5 years, Elena had played the role of the dutiful wife, silently observing Daniel's descent into arrogance. She had never revealed her true identity, never once hinted at the power her family controlled. But now, as Daniel signed the divorce papers without a second thought, Elena knew it was time to reveal the truth. The courthouse was quiet as Elena sat in the worn wooden chair, her fingers folded neatly in her lap. The room smelled of old wood and stale air, a place where people came to sever their connections, where lives were dissected and futures were torn apart. Elena had been here before, but never like this. She wasn't the meek woman who had walked into this building 5 years ago, wide-eyed and uncertain. She was no longer the quiet secretary, the one who had let Daniel control everything. No, today she was something else entirely. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the courtroom, casting long shadows across the cold stone floor. Daniel sat across from her, his face a mask of arrogance, as usual. His new lawyer, a sleek, middle-aged man named Marcus Webb, sat beside him. Daniel's eyes kept drifting to Elena, and though he tried to hide it, there was a flicker of doubt in his gaze. The woman he had treated like an afterthought, like a footnote in his story, was suddenly the most important person in the room. Elena didn't speak. She didn't need to. She was waiting for the right moment, and it was coming soon. Flashback, Elena's preparation. It had taken years to get to this point. Years of carefully observing Daniel, cataloging his actions, watching his arrogance grow, watching him slip further into the man she had always known him to be. She had known from the moment they got married that she was never truly seen by him. She was just a means to an end, a partner who could help him climb the corporate ladder, someone who would play the role of the dutiful wife. But Elena had always been more than that. Her father had taught her early on to observe, to study people for who they truly were. He had warned her that the truth about a person only comes out when they think there will be no consequences. Daniel had shown her exactly who he was when he believed she was nobody. But she was not nobody. Her father's teachings had always stayed with her, even when Daniel had dismissed them. Power, wealth, and status meant nothing in the world her father had built. She had learned that the true measure of a person's character wasn't in how they acted when everyone was watching. It was how they acted when they thought no one important was looking. Present day, the moment of truth, Judge Richardson cleared her throat, bringing Elena's attention back to the present. The woman behind the bench, in her late 60s, had the air of someone who had seen it all. She had a no-nonsense reputation, and today, Elena needed that. She felt a familiar thrum of anxiety in her chest, but she pushed it down. This was the moment where Daniel would finally see the truth. Elena looked over at Daniel, who was busy whispering to his attorney. He hadn't even looked at her yet, hadn't even acknowledged her presence, except for the brief, dismissive glances he had thrown her way since they had entered the courtroom. He was too busy planning his next move, too sure of his own superiority. But Elena knew better now. She knew exactly what was about to happen. The judge adjusted her glasses and flipped through the documents in front of her. She looked up at Elena. "Mrs. Morrison, I have some unusual documentation that was filed last night. A notice regarding the estate of Thomas Carter, deceased." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She had expected this. Her father's death had been hard to bear, but she had compartmentalized her grief. She had to. Her eyes flicked briefly to Daniel. He had no idea. Elena's father, Thomas Carter, had been a man of unparalleled wealth and power, but he had operated in the shadows, keeping his empire so carefully hidden that even the most seasoned financial experts couldn't calculate the full extent of it. Her eyes met Daniel's for the first time since the hearing began. His arrogance faltered just for a second. His expression was unreadable, but his lips parted as he stared at her in confusion. "Mrs. Morrison," Judge Richardson continued, her voice gaining a slight edge, "is Thomas Carter your father?" Elena nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, Your Honor." The room fell silent. The weight of her answer hung in the air, palpable and suffocating. The shock on Daniel's face was priceless. He opened his mouth to speak, but faltered, his mind racing to process the words he had just heard. He had never asked about her family. Never once in their 5 years of marriage had he shown an ounce of interest in where she came from. And now, the truth was coming out. The judge pulled a leather-bound document from a folder. Elena recognized it immediately. It was her father's will. The very document that would change everything. Flashback, the will. When Elena's father had passed, she had quietly flown out to Montana to handle his affairs. The funeral had been small, private, just her and the few people her father had trusted. He had never wanted a grand ceremony, not for himself. But the will, that was different. Her father had made sure that everything was in place, that she would be taken care of. But it also made sure that the inheritance came with responsibilities. He had given her everything, the estates, the mineral rights, the offshore accounts, the investments spread across the globe, but he had made it clear she could never use the family name. Her father had warned her about people like Daniel, people who would take advantage of kindness, of vulnerability, people who would only value you for what they could gain. And so, she had lived a life of silence, of humility. She had concealed her wealth, playing the role of the poor, overlooked wife. She had allowed Daniel to treat her like she was insignificant, even though she knew she could end him with a single phone call. She had waited, watched, and observed, and now it was time to act. Present day, the unraveling. The judge's voice broke through her thoughts. According to this document, Thomas Carter's estate, including his mineral rights, investments, and properties, is valued at approximately $214 billion. Mrs. Morrison, you are the sole beneficiary. Daniel's face turned an ashen gray. His eyes widened in disbelief. The confident smirk he had been wearing just moments before was gone. I need to request a recess, Marcus Webb stammered, rising to his feet. This is unprecedented. But Judge Richardson wasn't having it. Sit down, Mr. Webb. The will was filed properly, and it's time to move forward. Daniel's eyes finally locked with Elena's, and for the first time in years he saw her, not the quiet, meek woman who had cooked his meals and folded his shirts, but the woman who had quietly controlled empires from the shadows. The woman who had been waiting for this moment. And your prenuptial agreement, Judge Richardson continued, explicitly states that all assets, including this inheritance, are separate property. Mr. Morrison, your entitlement is limited to what you brought into this marriage. Daniel's face reddened, and his lips trembled as he protested. This can't be real. I never signed any. But Elena was already rising from her seat, the air in the room thick with tension. You signed, Daniel. You signed without reading, she said, her voice calm but unwavering. You were too eager to get through the wedding, too convinced that I had nothing worth protecting. The judge slammed the gavel. This court grants a divorce as requested. All assets will be distributed according to the prenuptial agreement. The courtroom had fallen silent, a heavy stillness hanging in the air as Daniel stood frozen, the world around him shifting in ways he couldn't process. His fingers trembled slightly. The expensive pen he'd been using earlier now lying discarded on the floor. The hum of murmured voices from the gallery behind him faded into the background as his mind raced. He had been sure of his victory. Divorce was supposed to be easy. It was supposed to be his freedom, his escape from a marriage that had long since grown stale. And now, everything was unraveling in front of him, and he couldn't understand why. Elena Carter, his wife of 5 years, wasn't just another meek woman, a quiet secretary he had once taken pity on. No, she was the heir to a billion-dollar empire, and he hadn't known. He had spent years dismissing her, treating her like a subordinate, like an afterthought in his pursuit of success. He had ignored every hint, every small, almost imperceptible clue that suggested Elena was more than what she appeared to be. How had he missed this? The revelation was too much to digest all at once. The woman he had treated with disdain, the one he had ridiculed for her quiet, modest demeanor, had been the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the world. And now, the consequences of his arrogance were crashing down on him like a tidal wave. Flashback, the first signs of change. Daniel hadn't always been this way. He hadn't always been arrogant, self-assured, and blinded by ambition. Once, he had been insecure, buried under student loans and debt, struggling to make ends meet. But that was before he had met Elena. She had been kind, patient, and attentive. She had noticed him when no one else had. Daniel had been just another law school graduate, barely scraping by, working in a firm that hardly acknowledged his existence. Elena, at the time, was just a secretary. Her smile had been genuine, warm, and unassuming. They had begun their relationship slowly, nothing flashy, just quiet coffee dates and long conversations about their futures. It was simple, it was easy, and it felt real. But when Daniel's career took off, he began to change. Slowly at first. A new suit here, a fancier dinner there. Soon, he was buying things, expensive things, and Elena, with her modest salary, began to feel like an anchor. She wasn't keeping up with him. And that's when things started to shift. The first time Daniel had cheated on Elena, it hadn't been an accident. It had been a decision, one that came after months of emotional distance. His focus had been entirely on climbing the corporate ladder. He had stopped noticing her, stopped loving her. She had become invisible in his world of success and status. Present day, the quiet revenge. The will reading had sent shockwaves through the courtroom. But for Elena, it was just the beginning. The true purpose of this moment had never been about the money. It wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about power. It was about showing Daniel who he had become and who he had failed to see in her. Elena stood still, her face impassive as Daniel fumbled with the facts, his lawyer scrambling to make sense of everything. The rest of the room was abuzz with whispers, but Elena remained untouched, her calmness almost unnerving. She had known this day would come, the day when she would finally reveal the truth. Elena glanced at the judge, whose stern expression had softened just slightly when the implications of her inheritance were revealed. This was justice, but it was also a lesson that Daniel had refused to learn for 5 years. Flashback, Elena's quiet observation. Elena had always been observant, even when she had chosen to remain silent. She had carefully recorded every moment of Daniel's emotional abuse, every time he belittled her, every time he had ignored her needs. She had kept a journal, one that her father had taught her how to maintain, an intricate, detailed record of the true nature of their marriage. She had recorded the exact date when Daniel stopped being affectionate. She had documented the moments when his indifference had started to feel like cruelty. His emotional neglect had been a constant, creeping force in their marriage, and Elena had been nothing but patient. Her father's lessons had always been clear. Observe, document, understand. Elena had never planned to expose Daniel's actions. But when he crossed the line, when he began to treat her as nothing more than a means to an end, that's when she made the decision. It wasn't just about leaving him. It was about making him understand the consequences of his actions. She had the power to destroy him, but she didn't. Not yet. She had waited, just as her father had taught her to. Present day, Daniel's realization. Back in the courtroom, Daniel's world was falling apart. He could feel the eyes of the gallery on him, could feel their judgment as the judge continued to read from the will. His throat was dry, his palms sweaty. He hadn't prepared for this. What was more surprising, though, was that Elena wasn't gloating. She wasn't standing there, reveling in his downfall. She simply watched him, her gaze steady, unfazed by his panic. The complete indifference in her eyes made him feel smaller than he ever had before. Daniel had assumed that because he had money, because he had status, he was untouchable. And yet, Elena had waited until this moment to expose him. She had known all along, hadn't she? She had known about Rebecca, about the apartment he had rented, about the money he had hidden. And all the while, she had stayed silent, observing him with cold detachment. And now, he realized she had won. Flashback, the night before. The night before the will was read, Elena had sat alone in her apartment, contemplating the last 5 years of her life. She had thought back to the early days of their marriage, when she had believed in the possibility of change, when she had thought that love could heal the deep insecurities Daniel had carried. But she had been wrong. She had given him everything, her trust, her loyalty, and her patience. But Daniel had never been capable of giving her the same in return. Her father had always said that power is not just about wealth or status. It's about control. Elena had the power to destroy Daniel with one phone call, but she had chosen not to. Instead, she chose to watch him self-destruct. She chose to give him the freedom to reveal himself to the world. Present day, the final step. Elena stood as the judge concluded the will reading. Daniel's face had gone from pale to crimson. The realization was settling in. He had been outplayed. But what really stung wasn't the loss of wealth, nor the dissolution of their marriage. It was the knowledge that Elena had seen him for who he truly was, and had let him destroy himself. She hadn't needed to humiliate him. She hadn't needed to expose his secrets. His own actions had done that for him. As she turned to leave the courtroom, Elena's voice broke the silence. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice carrying across the room, "I want you to understand something. Every day of our marriage, I had the power to end your career with one phone call. I could have destroyed everything you've built, but I didn't." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened in disbelief. He had no idea how far Elena's influence had stretched. She had been watching him, documenting him, waiting. "I didn't make that call," Elena continued, her voice steady, "because I wanted to see how far you would go, how much of your true character would be revealed when you thought there would be no consequences." Elena's gaze locked onto Daniel's, and for the first time, he saw her clearly. "And now, Daniel," she said, her words final, "you'll learn what it's like to live with the consequences of your own actions." The air in Philadelphia was dense with the first hint of winter, cold and unrelenting, a reflection of Daniel's own internal state. His life, which had once felt so meticulously constructed, was now crumbling piece by piece as the consequences of his arrogance and neglect sank in deeper each day. In the days following the courtroom revelation, Daniel's world had shifted dramatically. His firm, once the bedrock of his professional identity, had become his personal hell. The whispers among his colleagues had grown louder, and his reputation had plummeted to an all-time low. The once proud attorney, who had once been on the fast track to becoming a partner at Hartford & Associates, was now seen as nothing more than a cautionary tale. Flashback, the rise. Daniel's ascent to success had always been driven by his fear. Fear of failure, fear of being nothing, fear of being like the people he grew up with, people who never amounted to anything. The hunger for success had consumed him, pushing him to work harder, sacrifice more, and climb higher, no matter the cost. When he first started at Hartford, he had been a lowly associate, drowning in debt, struggling to pay his rent in an apartment much smaller than the one he had now. His clothes were cheap, his meals were takeout, and every day was a reminder of just how far he had to go. But then, something shifted. He started winning cases. Big ones. His confidence grew, and so did his bank account. The expensive suits, the high-end car, the luxury apartment. They all came, one after another, like reward for his hard work. But it wasn't just his success that changed him. It was the way he saw the world. He began to look down on those around him, including Elena. Elena, the woman who had loved him when he had nothing, when he was just a dreamer in a small apartment, had slowly become invisible to him. She had become the person he could dismiss, the one he could mold into what he wanted. And in his mind, she wasn't enough. She wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't stylish enough, wasn't worthy enough. Present day, the collapse. Daniel stared at his desk, the Rolex on his wrist a constant reminder of the life he had built. Only now, it felt like a weight, a burden. His once pristine office, filled with sleek furniture and expensive artwork, now felt like a prison. Every call, every email, every glance from his colleagues made him feel smaller, weaker. "Mr. Morrison?" A voice called from the doorway. Daniel looked up to see his assistant standing in the doorway, a thin slip of paper in her hand. "What is it?" Daniel replied, his voice tight. She hesitated. "It's from the Pennsylvania Bar Association. They suspended your license." Daniel's heart dropped into his stomach. He had known this was coming. He had known for days. But hearing the words out loud, hearing the weight of his failure in such a simple sentence, was crushing. His career, the very thing he had built from the ground up, was slipping away. "Is there anything I can do?" his assistant asked, though Daniel knew there was nothing she could offer. Nothing could fix this. "No," Daniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll handle it." As the assistant left, Daniel sat in the silence of his office, the world outside the window moving on without him. He couldn't help but think of Elena, of everything she had said to him in the courtroom. She had been so calm, so assured, as she had delivered her words, and he had been blind. He had dismissed her, ridiculed her, and in the process destroyed everything they had. Flashback, the turning point. It had been 2 months before the divorce proceedings began when Daniel had realized, albeit too late, how far he had fallen. He was sitting in his office, staring at a report, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was familiar. Rebecca Chun, his affair partner. "Daniel," she said, her voice cool. "We need to talk. I found out something. I think you should know." He had been confused at first, but the shock came when she told him the truth about Elena's inheritance. He didn't believe her at first. How could he? Elena had always seemed so ordinary to him. But when the truth began to unfold, it shattered him. Elena had been hiding a fortune all along, a fortune her father had built from the ground up, wealth that dwarfed everything Daniel had ever earned. The moment that realization hit him, his ego shattered. The woman he had mocked, the woman he had belittled for years, was one of the richest people in the world, and he had thrown it all away. The realization didn't hit him with the force of anger, as he had expected. It hit him with an overwhelming wave of regret. The truth was out now, and all that was left for him was to watch the pieces of his life fall apart. Present day, the final blow. The next few days were a blur. Emails and phone calls from colleagues, from legal clients, from former associates. People who once looked up to him, now offering nothing but polite condolences, empty words. Nothing could fix the damage. Nothing could undo the choices he had made. The firm terminated his contract, effective immediately. The news had come in a brief email, and the weight of it had crushed him. His career, his reputation, his entire identity had been built around his work. Now it was all gone. And then came the hardest blow. Rebecca, his affair partner, the one he thought would stand by him, had left. She had barely given him a second glance after the scandal broke, and now she was gone. Her family's dealership, the one he had so eagerly associated himself with, was filing for bankruptcy. She had made a clean break, moving on to someone with more power, more potential. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, had turned to dust. But what truly crushed him, what truly haunted him, was the thought of Elena. She had been right. All along, she had seen the truth about him. She had known who he was, even before he did. Flashback, the realization. It was late one evening when Daniel found himself staring at the TV screen. The local news was running a segment on Elena. She had been featured as part of a new philanthropic initiative, one that aimed to provide financial literacy and support to underprivileged families in Philadelphia. As he watched, something inside him twisted with pain. He had dismissed her, ignored her, treated her like she was nothing, and now she was changing the world. The last thing he had ever expected was for Elena to find happiness, to thrive after their marriage. But there she was on the screen, smiling in a way he had never seen her smile during their time together. She had found peace. She had found purpose. And he had lost everything. Present day, the wake of destruction. Daniel's life was reduced to a series of mundane tasks. Papers to sign, phone calls to return, appointments to make. He had learned to put on the mask of normalcy, but beneath it, he was hollow. He couldn't escape the thought of what he had lost, of how he had treated Elena, and the immense price he had paid for it. In the months that followed, Daniel would find himself questioning every decision he'd ever made, wondering when he'd stopped seeing Elena for the person she truly was, for the woman who had always been worthy of his respect, his love, and his admiration. But by then it was far too late. The days stretched out like an endless sea of gray. The cold of Philadelphia was no longer a mere reflection of the season. It had settled deep inside Daniel, freezing him to the bone. Every corner of his life, from his luxury car to the empty apartment he now called home, reminded him of how far he had fallen. The once thriving future he had imagined for himself had evaporated. What was left? Nothing but a crumbling facade. The city outside continued to hustle and bustle, people rushing to and fro, living their lives. But Daniel couldn't see it. He was blind to it all. The cold weight of his decisions had consumed him. There was no escape, no distraction, no redemption, at least not yet. Flashback, the turning point. It had all started with a mistake. A single moment of weakness that Daniel had convinced himself he could control, that it wouldn't matter. He had been meeting with Rebecca, as he often did when Elena wasn't around. At first, their meetings had been filled with the thrill of secrecy and excitement of something forbidden. But over time, those emotions faded, replaced with something far more dangerous: arrogance. He had forgotten the most important thing his father had taught him. Never underestimate the people who care about you, because they're the ones who will see your downfall first. Elena had always been that person, always there, always supporting him. But he had ignored her, dismissed her for someone who could offer him a taste of something new, something exciting. The night he had signed the divorce papers, Elena had stood before him, unwavering, calm, like she had known something he didn't. And she had. Present day, the confrontation. It was a rainy afternoon when Daniel received a message. It came in the form of an email from an unknown account, its subject line short and to the point: "We need to talk." The email itself was simple, written in the same cold, detached manner Daniel had grown accustomed to. But there was something about it, something that stirred a sense of dread in him. The email was from Elena. He stared at it for a moment, debating whether he should open it, whether he was ready to confront the truth. But then he clicked the message open. "Meet me at the old estate. I need you to understand everything before it's too late." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The old estate. The place he hadn't thought about in years. The Carter family estate, deep in the Pennsylvania countryside. The sprawling mansion where Elena had grown up, where her wealth had always been hidden from the world. The place she had left behind when she married him, choosing the simplicity of life with him over the opulence she had been born into. Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat, shoved his phone into his pocket, and headed out the door. The rain was coming down in sheets, but he barely noticed as he drove through the empty streets, his mind reeling with confusion. Why now? Why was Elena reaching out to him? And more importantly, what did she mean by understand everything? Flashback, the Carter legacy. Daniel had only been to the Carter estate once, on the day he and Elena had gotten married. He had thought it was just another part of her family's charm. But now, in the cold, unrelenting downpour, he couldn't help but wonder how much he had overlooked. The mansion was massive but quiet, eerily so. No one had ever really seen Elena's family. They were a name, an enigma in the financial world. What he hadn't known then, what he had refused to acknowledge, was that Elena's wealth wasn't just about her father's successful business ventures. Thomas Carter had controlled industries, more than Daniel could ever imagine. Everything from tech to real estate, from mining to pharmaceuticals, was in Elena's name now. Her quiet, humble persona had been a carefully crafted veil, one that kept her true nature hidden from the world. But Daniel had never thought to look. Present day, the old estate. Daniel arrived at the estate just as the sky darkened further. The mansion loomed before him, its tall, ivy-covered walls casting a shadow over the rain-soaked grounds. The front door was slightly ajar, and Daniel hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The house smelled of old wood and the faint scent of incense, as though it hadn't been lived in for years. He stepped inside, and the silence was suffocating. The hallway stretched out in front of him, lined with portraits of the Carter family, a lineage of power, wealth, and influence. He felt small under their watchful eyes. "Elena," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. A soft voice answered from upstairs. "Up here." Daniel's heart began to race. He knew this moment was coming. The moment where everything would finally be revealed, where the carefully constructed illusions would come crashing down. He ascended the grand staircase, his footsteps muted on the polished wood floors. When he reached the top, he saw her. Elena stood at the far end of the hallway, her back to him, gazing out a large window that overlooked the estate. She was different now. No longer the woman he had married, no longer the one who had quietly borne his insults. The woman before him had an aura of control, of power. "You wanted to see me?" Daniel asked, his voice strained. Elena turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "It's time, Daniel. You need to understand who I am, who I've always been." Her words hit him like a cold wave. She wasn't just talking about wealth. She was talking about power, the kind of power that shaped the world, the kind of power that had always been just below the surface of their marriage, hidden from him, the same power he had dismissed. "I know you've never understood me," she said, her voice low but steady. "You've always been too focused on yourself to see who I really am. I've let you think you were in control, but now you'll understand the consequences." Daniel swallowed hard. The arrogance that had once filled him began to fade as he took in the reality of the situation. Elena wasn't just an heiress. She was a force of nature, a woman who had been controlling the game from the shadows, using her silence as a weapon. Elena stepped closer to him, her eyes locking onto his. "I'm giving you one last chance, Daniel," she said. "A chance to understand, to apologize, to finally face what you've done. But you're running out of time." Flashback, Elena's decision. In the weeks before the divorce, Elena had made a decision. She could have destroyed Daniel in an instant, exposed him for the infidelities, the lies, and the manipulation. She could have used her wealth, her influence, her power, and ended his career in a heartbeat. But she hadn't. Instead, she had let him believe he was winning. She had allowed him to think that he was the one in control, all the while knowing she had the ability to bring him down whenever she chose. That was her power. Not wealth, not status, but the ability to withhold. And now, standing in front of him, Elena saw the truth. Daniel had never been worthy of her. He had never understood the depth of her character, the strength she possessed. But now he would. Now he would see the real Elena, the woman who had always been more than just a quiet, loyal wife. She was a force that Daniel had never respected, never appreciated, and it was time for him to face the consequences. Present day, the final lesson. Daniel stood there helpless, as Elena's words sank in. There was no more room for denial, no more excuses. She had given him every chance to understand her, to see her for who she was. But he had squandered each one. "Elena, Daniel began, his voice cracking. "No," she interrupted, her eyes cold. "You don't get to speak. Not anymore." Her gaze softened just for a moment before she continued. "I gave you everything. My love, my loyalty, and you treated me like I was nothing." Daniel could feel the weight of her words, like 1,000 bricks crashing down on him. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. And Elena was finally taking what she deserved. Elena turned and walked toward the window, her back to him once again. "I've learned one thing through all of this, Daniel. People show their true selves when they think there are no consequences. And you are exactly who I thought you were." With that, Elena turned, her face expressionless. "Goodbye, Daniel." And just like that, he was alone in the vast, cold mansion, alone with the wreckage of everything he had built. The night was heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Daniel stood in the middle of the vast Carter estate, the world outside pressing against the glass windows, a rainstorm lashing at the mansion. His world had come apart piece by piece, and now, in the eerie silence, it was time for him to confront the consequences of his actions. He had walked into this house a man full of pride, certain of his place in the world, certain that his career, his power, and his status could never be taken from him. But now, he was a shadow of the man he once was. His license had been revoked, his career destroyed, his reputation in tatters. The firm had severed ties with him. Rebecca had walked out without a word, her departure another blow to his bruised ego. And the woman he had mocked and belittled for years had not only outlasted him, but had shattered the very foundation of his life. He had been so sure that he had made it, that he was above it all. But in the end, it was Elena who had the last laugh. Elena, who had kept silent, kept her power hidden, and waited for the perfect moment to expose the truth. Now, standing in the grand foyer of the estate, Daniel couldn't help but wonder, how did he get here? How had he missed the signs? How had he not seen Elena for who she truly was? Flashback, the first warning signs. It had started with small things, subtle hints that Daniel had ignored, thinking they were inconsequential. Elena's quiet demeanor had always stood in stark contrast to his growing arrogance, but he had dismissed it. He had never thought much of her family's background, thinking it was just another rich but irrelevant legacy. After all, she was just a lawyer's daughter, no more important than anyone else he knew in his social circle. But Elena was always watching. She had never demanded attention. She had never sought the spotlight. And that was the part Daniel never understood. She didn't need him. She didn't need anyone. Her father, Thomas Carter, had built his empire in silence. No one knew the depth of his wealth or influence, not even Daniel. Elena had grown up in a world where wealth was inherited, not flaunted. She had seen the toll it had taken on her father, the way it had hardened him, shaped his choices, and turned him into a recluse. But Elena wasn't like him. She had learned to be patient, to observe, to wait. When she married Daniel, it had been out of love, out of desire to be with someone who saw her for who she truly was, not just the heiress of a secret fortune. Present day, the final decision. Elena stood by the window, her silhouette outlined by the storm. The mansion was quiet now, the storm outside seemingly in harmony with the storm inside Daniel's mind. He had been in this house for hours, sitting in the same spot, waiting for something, some kind of epiphany, some realization that would make sense of everything. But nothing had come. He couldn't escape his guilt. His mind replayed every moment of his life with Elena, the moments he had taken for granted, the times he had belittled her, the words he had said in anger, the moments when she had silently endured his cruelty, never once retaliating, never once showing him the power she held. Daniel stood up, his legs shaky, and walked over the window where Elena stood. "Elena," he began, his voice weak. She turned to him, her eyes cold but filled with something else, something Daniel couldn't place. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction in her victory. There was just distance. "You don't get to apologize, Daniel," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You've made your choices, and I've made mine. This isn't about us anymore. This is about you facing the consequences of what you've done." Flashback, the moment of truth. The night before the divorce papers had been signed, Elena had been sitting in her bedroom, looking out over the estate. It had taken everything in her not to confront Daniel sooner. She had thought about it more times than she could count. She had thought about confronting him when he had first started treating her like she was beneath him. She had considered telling him everything about her father's wealth, about the empire that had been built over decades. But it was never the right moment. Every time she thought she was ready, Every time she thought she could speak the truth, the doubt crept in. Was she doing this for the right reasons? Was she seeking revenge? Or was she truly ready to let go of everything? But the answer had come to her on that rainy night, when Daniel had signed the divorce papers, dismissing her without a second thought. It was about control. It was about Daniel's refusal to see her, to understand the power that she had always quietly held. And in that moment, Elena realized that it wasn't just about getting back at him. It was about letting go of a man who had never truly loved her, a man who had only loved the idea of her. Present day, the final confrontation. Daniel watched as Elena turned her back to him again, her attention shifting to the storm outside. He couldn't remember the last time he had truly looked at her, the last time he had really seen her for who she was. Strong, independent, self-assured. "I'm sorry, Elena," Daniel said again, his voice breaking. "I should have treated you better. I should have—" She held up a hand, silencing him. "It's too late for apologies, Daniel. You had your chances. I gave you more chances than you deserved." Daniel's throat tightened and he stepped forward, his eyes searching her face for any sign of vulnerability, any sign of softness. But there was nothing. She was a fortress, her resolve impenetrable. "You don't understand, do you?" she said quietly. "This was never about revenge. This was never about making you suffer. This was about me finally standing up for myself. For once, I let you destroy me for far too long." Daniel felt his chest tighten as he took a step back. It was as though the air had been sucked out of the room. He had spent so long justifying his actions, so long rationalizing his decisions, but now he had nothing. "You've had every opportunity to redeem yourself, Daniel, but you chose to ignore me, to ignore everything I was telling you. I stayed silent, let you believe I was weak, but I've always known who I was. And now," Elena's voice broke slightly, but only for a moment before she steadied herself. "Now, you'll see who I really am." Her words hung in the air like a heavy weight, suffocating him, making him feel smaller than he had ever felt in his entire life. "Goodbye, Daniel," Elena said quietly, turning away from him for the final time. Flashback, the letter. Later that evening, as Daniel sat alone in the mansion, a letter arrived. It was sealed with an official Carter family crest, something Elena had never shared with him. He opened it, his hands trembling as he read the contents. It was a letter from Elena, explaining her decision to dissolve their marriage. She spoke of her love for him once, but now she had realized that love wasn't enough. She spoke of the inheritance, the wealth that had been hidden for years, and how she had chosen to let him make his own choices, to let him reveal who he truly was. The letter ended with a simple sentence: "I hope one day you'll understand the truth." Present day, the final step. Daniel sat there, the letter crumpled in his hands. The weight of his own actions had never been more evident. He had lost everything: the career, the woman, the life he had spent so long building. He had thought he was untouchable, that his status and power could shield him from the consequences of his arrogance. But he was wrong. He had never understood Elena. But now, as he sat in the cold, empty mansion, he finally realized that it wasn't her who had changed. It was him. And in the end, it was his own choices that had brought him to this place. Elena had already moved on. She had taken control of her life, of her future, and Daniel was left with nothing but the pieces of his shattered ego. The rain continued to fall, the storm outside mirroring the turmoil inside Daniel's heart. But it was too late for regret. There was no undoing what he had done.